The silence stretched across the Pacific theater like a held breath, broken only by the distant hum of twin Pratt and Whitney engines cutting through crystalline air at 38,000 feet. Lieutenant Colonel Kestrel Ghost Thorne adjusted her oxygen mask, fingers dancing across the F-22 Raptor's glass cockpit with practiced precision. The stealth fighter responded to her touch like a living thing, its angular surfaces drinking in radar waves and giving nothing back. "Phantom Lead, this is Control." The voice crackled through her headset, tinged with the particular tension that meant something had gone very wrong. "We have multiple bogies approaching your patrol sector. Unknown configuration. You are weapons free." Ghost's pale eyes swept the horizon through her helmet-mounted display, searching for contrails that shouldn't exist in this carefully monitored airspace. The intelligence briefing had been clear. No friendly aircraft were scheduled in this sector for the next 6 hours. Yet here she was, lead pilot of a four-ship formation of the world's most advanced air superiority fighters, hunting ghosts in empty sky. "Control, Phantom Lead. I have nothing on scope. Confirm bogey count and bearing." Her voice carried the calm authority earned through 12 years of military aviation, though something in her gut twisted like barbed wire. The radar screen remained stubbornly clean, its sweep painting nothing but the blue-green glow of empty airspace. "Phantom Lead Control. Count 4 bogies, bearing 270, Angels 40. They appeared out of nowhere 30 seconds ago." The controller's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Ghost felt ice crystals form in her veins. Aircraft didn't just appear out of nowhere. Not unless they possessed the same stealth technology that made her Raptor nearly invisible to conventional radar. She banked left, following the heading Control had provided, her wingmen, Viper, Hawk, and Steel, maintaining perfect formation discipline despite the growing uncertainty. The Pacific stretched endlessly below, its surface broken only by whitecaps that looked like scattered diamonds from this altitude. Ghost had flown these waters countless times, knew every shipping lane and weather pattern, every electromagnetic signature that belonged and every anomaly that didn't. But this felt different. This felt like the sky itself was holding secrets, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. Ghost's right hand moved unconsciously to the small silver pendant hanging from her dog tags, a habit born from another life, another loss that haunted her dreams. The metal felt warm against her gloved fingertips, as if the ghost of its original owner still whispered warnings across the void. The bogies materialized on her screen like digital phantoms, their returns barely stronger than background noise. 4 contacts, flying in perfect formation, approaching from the west with aggressive intent. Ghost's training kicked in, muscle memory guiding her hands as she armed her AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles and began the complex dance of air-to-air combat. "All Phantoms, this is Lead. Tally 4 bandits, 12 o'clock level. Engage on my mark." Her voice cut through the radio chatter with surgical precision, each word calculated to convey maximum information with minimum ambiguity. In aerial combat, clarity meant survival, and Ghost had survived longer than most by speaking the language of war fluently. The unknown aircraft began to separate, spreading into a tactical formation that spoke of professional military training. These weren't rogue pilots or confused civilians who had wandered into restricted airspace. These were warriors, flying with the kind of disciplined aggression that only came from years of combat experience. Ghost felt her pulse quicken, adrenaline sharpening her senses to razor focus. "Phantom 2, take high CAP. 3 and 4, bracket left and right. We're going to squeeze them into a box they can't escape from." Her formation spread like the fingers of a closing fist, each pilot instinctively understanding the tactical geometry that would maximize their advantage. The F-22's superior maneuverability and stealth capabilities gave them the edge, but only if they used them correctly. The engagement began without fanfare. A deadly ballet performed at supersonic speeds 38,000 feet above the Pacific. Ghost watched her radar screen as the bogies accelerated, their heat signatures blooming like digital flowers as afterburners ignited. Whatever they were flying, it was fast and agile, cutting through the thin air with predatory grace. Fox 3, Ghost called, triggering her first AMRAAM missile. The weapon streaked away from her aircraft on a tail of white fire, its radar seeker locked onto the lead bogey. Around her, her wingmen followed suit, their missiles painting brilliant contrails across the azure sky like brushstrokes of impending doom. But something was wrong. The bogies weren't evading with the panic of surprised enemies. Instead, they maintained formation discipline, their maneuvers coordinated with a precision that spoke of intimate knowledge of American air combat tactics. Ghost felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperatures at altitude. "Control, Phantom Lead. These guys know our playbook. They're not running scared." Her voice carried a note of professional concern, the kind that experienced combat pilots developed after seeing too many good pilots die from underestimating their opponents. The radar returns showed her missiles closing on their targets, but the bogies showed no sign of breaking formation. "Phantom Lead, control copies. Row remains weapons-free. Take them down." The controller's response was immediate and unambiguous, but Ghost detected something else in his voice: uncertainty, maybe even fear. Ground controllers weren't supposed to be afraid. They were supposed to be the calm voice of authority guiding their aerial charges through the chaos of combat. The first AMRAAM struck home, its proximity fuse detonating in a brilliant flash that momentarily whited out her helmet display. When the sensors recalibrated, one of the bogies had simply vanished, leaving only a dispersing cloud of metallic chaff and the ghost echo of a radar return. But the other three continued their approach, undeterred by the loss of their wingman. Ghost began a defensive turn, her Raptor bleeding altitude as she dove toward the deck, using gravity and aerodynamics to build energy for the next phase of the engagement. The Pacific rushed up to meet her, its surface detail becoming more pronounced as she descended through layers of increasingly dense atmosphere. At 20,000 feet, she leveled off and reversed course, coming up behind the remaining bogies with the sun at her back. The tactical situation had shifted in her favor, but Ghost couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial. These pilots were good, too good to be random hostiles stumbling into American airspace. Their formation discipline, their knowledge of F-22 capabilities, their willingness to engage despite being outgunned and outmaneuvered, it all pointed to something larger than a simple border incursion. "Phantom 3, you have bandits bearing 090, 15 miles and closing. They're trying to bracket us." Hawk's voice carried the strain of sustained G-forces as he maneuvered to counter the new threat. Ghost felt her jaw clench as she realized the scope of what they were facing. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a carefully orchestrated engagement designed to test American capabilities and response times. Her fingers found the pendant again, its familiar way to anchor point in the chaos of aerial combat. The silver medal had belonged to another pilot, another Ghost who had flown these same waters 12 years ago and never returned home. Lieutenant Riley, Songbird Cross had been Ghost's instructor, mentor, and closest friend, until the day her F-16 had simply vanished from radar screens during a routine patrol mission. The investigation had found nothing: no wreckage, no distress calls, no explanation for how one of the Navy's most experienced pilots could simply cease to exist. Ghost had inherited more than just Riley's pendant that day. She had inherited her call sign, her reputation, and her ghosts. Every mission since had been an attempt to solve a mystery that refused to stay solved. Now, 38,000 feet above the Pacific, Ghost felt the familiar whisper of déjà vu. The tactical situation, the mysterious bogies appearing from nowhere, the feeling that she was dancing to someone else's choreography. It all felt like an echo of that day 12 years ago when Riley Cross had vanished into the blue. "Phantom Lead, this is Steele. I have a visual on Bandit 3. Something's not right about his configuration." Steele's voice carried the kind of controlled excitement that came with spotting something unusual in the middle of a firefight. Ghost rolled inverted and pulled through a barrel roll that brought the remaining bogies into her field of view, their sleek shapes silhouetted against the afternoon sun. What she saw made her blood freeze in her veins. The aircraft weren't foreign fighters or experimental prototypes. They were American F-16 Fighting Falcons, their distinctive profiles unmistakable even at this range. But they had been modified in ways that defied explanation: extended wings, enlarged intakes, and a canopy configuration that spoke of extensive aerodynamic refinement. Control, Phantom Lead. Bandits are showing American profiles. Repeat, American profiles. I need immediate verification of friendly positions in this sector. Ghost's training warred with her instincts as she held fire, her finger hovering over the weapon release. The rules of engagement were clear, but shooting down aircraft that might be friendly was a line no pilot wanted to cross. Phantom Lead Control. Negative on friendly aircraft in your sector. All American assets are accounted for and outside your area of operations. You are cleared to engage. The controller's response came quickly, but Ghost detected something else, a note of confusion that mirrored her own. The lead F-16 began a series of maneuvers that should have been impossible for the older airframe. It climbed at angles that would have stalled a conventional Fighting Falcon, its modified engines producing thrust ratios that belonged in the realm of experimental aircraft. Ghost watched through her helmet-mounted display as it executed a Cobra maneuver that would have made a Russian test pilot proud. Jesus, Control. These aren't standard Vipers. Someone's been playing with the aerodynamics. Hawk's voice carried professional admiration mixed with tactical concern. In the world of military aviation, technological surprises rarely came with good intentions. The fact that someone had managed to modify F-16s to this degree without American intelligence knowledge suggested resources and capabilities that belonged to very few organizations. Ghost made her decision with the cold calculation that had kept her alive through a dozen combat deployments. Regardless of their origin, these aircraft had entered restricted airspace during a period of heightened tensions and had engaged American forces with hostile intent. The rules of engagement were clear, and her duty was unambiguous. All Phantoms, this is lead. Weapons free. Take them down. Her command cut through the radio chatter with final authority. Around her, the four-ship formation of F-22 Raptors moved with deadly precision, their pilots executing attack runs that had been practiced thousands of times in simulators and training flights. The modified F-16 scattered like startled birds, their pilots finally showing the kind of evasive behavior expected from aircraft under attack. But their maneuvers were too coordinated, too professional for mere panic. Ghost found herself engaging in a deadly game of chess played at Mach 1.5, each move calculated to gain advantage while denying the opponent opportunity. Her second AMRAAM streaked toward the lead F-16, its motor trail painting a line of destruction across the blue sky. But at the last moment, the enemy pilot executed a turn that physics suggested should have been impossible, bleeding energy and altitude in a maneuver that left Ghost's missile clutching at empty air. The weapon detonated harmlessly 2 miles behind its intended target, its expanding fragmentation pattern creating a momentary constellation of metallic debris. Phantom Lead, this is Viper. I'm Winchester on AMRAAMs and switching to guns. Viper's calm announcement carried the weight of tactical reality. Advanced missiles were powerful weapons, but they required lock-on parameters and minimum engagement distances. In a close-quarters dogfight, the venerable M61 Vulcan cannon remained the ultimate arbitrator. Ghost pulled her Raptor through a climbing spiral that brought her nose-to-nose with the lead F-16, her heads-up display painting targeting reticles across the canopy as she prepared for a gun run. Through the transparent aluminum of her helmet visor, she could see the opposing pilot clearly for the first time, a figure in an old-style flight suit and helmet that belonged in a museum rather than a modern cockpit. The sight triggered something in her memory, a half-formed recognition that danced just beyond conscious thought. She had seen that helmet configuration before, in photographs and briefings from another era. The distinctive shape belonged to pilots who had flown a generation ago, when air combat was measured in visual ranges and weapons were simpler, but no less deadly. Ghost, break right. Steele's warning came a split second before the F-16's cannon opened fire. 20. Projectiles streaming past her cockpit in lines of tracer fire that looked like deadly fireflies. Ghost rolled inverted and dove, using her aircraft's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to extend beyond gun range. The engagement had become personal, reduced to the fundamental equation of pilot skill and aircraft performance. The F-16 followed her dive with tenacious determination, its modified engines producing thrust plumes that glowed like twin stars against the darkening sky. Ghost felt the familiar sensation of G-forces pressing her into her ejection seat as she pulled through a series of defensive maneuvers designed to break the pursuit. But her opponent stayed with her, matching each turn with professional competence. Through her rearview mirrors, she caught another glimpse of the pursuing pilot, and this time the recognition hit her like a physical blow. The helmet, the flight suit, even the way the figure sat in the cockpit, it was all wrong for the current era. It belonged to pilots who had flown decades ago, before modern avionics and digital displays had transformed aerial warfare into an exercise in systems management. Control, Phantom Lead. I need immediate background checks on any missing aircraft from the past 20 years. These pilots are flying like they learned in another decade. Ghost's request carried the urgency of growing comprehension. Military aviation was a small community, and certain flying styles left signatures as distinctive as fingerprints. Phantom Lead, Control. Stand by for that information. Continue engagement per current row. The controller's response was professionally neutral, but Ghost detected the underlying tension. Someone on the ground was beginning to understand the implications of her request, and the answers were probably classified at levels that required special clearances to access. The tactical situation continued to evolve, as the remaining F-16s demonstrated capabilities that challenged everything Ghost thought she knew about the older airframe's limitations. They climbed, turned, and accelerated with performance characteristics that suggested extensive modifications to engines, flight controls, and structural components. Someone had invested enormous resources in upgrading these aircraft to near fifth-generation capabilities. Ghost found herself locked in single combat with the lead F-16, their aircraft dancing through the sky in a deadly spiral that carried them from 38,000 feet down toward the deck. The Pacific rushed up to meet them, its surface detail becoming increasingly sharp as they descended through layers of atmosphere that grew progressively thicker and more forgiving. At 10,000 feet, Ghost made her move. She throttled back and deployed speed brakes, causing her Raptor to decelerate so rapidly that the pursuing F-16 overshot her position. For a brief moment, their aircraft flew in formation, separated by less than 50 feet of crystalline air. Ghost turned her head and looked directly into the cockpit of her opponent. What she saw defied rational explanation. The pilot's helmet bore markings that she recognized from old squadron photographs, insignia that belonged to units disbanded years ago. More disturbing was the flight suit itself, an older pattern that had been replaced by current equipment decades earlier. It was as if she were engaged in aerial combat with a ghost from military aviation's past. The F-16 pilot turned to look at her, and Ghost felt her breath catch in her throat. Through the visor, she could see eyes that seemed familiar, a face that triggered memories she thought she had buried. But it was impossible. The person those eyes belonged to had been declared missing in action 12 years ago, after an F-16 had vanished without trace during a routine patrol mission. "Songbird," Ghost whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of twin engines and rushing air. The pendant at her throat seemed to grow warm, as if responding to proximity to its original owner. But Lieutenant Riley Cross was dead, lost somewhere over these same waters in circumstances that had never been adequately explained. The F-16 accelerated away from her position with a burst of afterburner that left Ghost trailing in its wake. She pushed her throttles to military power and gave chase, but her opponent had gained crucial separation distance. The engagement had shifted once again, and Ghost found herself playing catch-up in a game where the stakes grew higher with each passing minute. Her radio crackled with updates from her wingmen, their voices carrying the strain of sustained combat operations. Viper had scored a kill on one of the F-16s, his gun run ending with the enemy aircraft spinning into the ocean in a cloud of smoke and debris. But the remaining two continued to maneuver with undiminished skill, their pilots demonstrating the kind of tactical awareness that only came from years of combat experience. Phantom Lead, this is Control. We have information on your request. Several aircraft were reported missing over the past 2 decades, including F-16s from classified test programs. Details are restricted, but some of those pilots were never recovered. The controller's voice carried a weight that spoke of classified briefings and compartmentalized information. Ghost felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to align in her mind. Missing aircraft, vanished pilots, experimental programs that had operated in the shadows of official military structure. It painted a picture of something far more complex than a simple air-to-air engagement. The F-16s weren't foreign interceptors or terrorist weapons. They were American aircraft flown by American pilots who had supposedly died years ago. The tactical engagement continued as Ghost maneuvered for another gun run, her Raptor's superior stealth characteristics allowing her to approach undetected until the last moment. The F-16 pilot seemed to anticipate her attack vector, rolling inverted and diving toward the wave tops in a maneuver that required precise timing and absolute trust in aircraft systems. Ghost followed the dive, her altimeter unwinding rapidly as both aircraft descended toward the deck. At 2,000 feet, the F-16 leveled off and began a series of high-speed turns that hugged the ocean's surface. Spray kicked up from the wingtips as the modified fighter pulled G-forces that should have exceeded its structural limitations. Through her heads-up display, Ghost watched the F-16's flight path trace patterns across the water that seemed somehow familiar. The turns, the angles, the precise spacing between maneuvers. It was like watching someone write in a language she almost recognized. The realization struck her with the force of revelation. The F-16 pilot was trying to communicate something, using aircraft positioning as a form of coded message. Military pilots were trained in numerous forms of tactical communication, including visual signals and formation positions that could convey complex information without radio transmission. But what Ghost was observing went beyond standard procedures. This was personal communication, the kind that developed between pilots who had flown together extensively and learned each other's aerial signatures. Control, Phantom Lead. I'm observing possible coded maneuvering from the lead bandit. Request guidance on rules of engagement if hostile intent is unclear. Ghost's transmission reflected the growing complexity of the tactical situation. The F-16 was still technically a threat, but its pilot's behavior suggested motivations that extended beyond simple aggression. Phantom Lead Control, ROW remains unchanged. Hostile aircraft in restricted airspace are to be engaged and destroyed. Continue prosecution. The response carried the weight of policy and procedure, but Ghost detected something else: reluctance, perhaps even uncertainty. Someone on the ground was beginning to question whether this engagement was as straightforward as it had initially appeared. The F-16 began a climbing turn that brought it back toward Ghost's altitude, but the maneuver lacked the aggressive intent of an attack run. Instead, it seemed almost like an invitation, a request for formation flight rather than continued combat. Ghost found herself faced with a tactical decision that would determine not just the outcome of the engagement, but potentially the resolution of mysteries that had haunted her for over a decade. Her finger hovered over the trigger of her M61 cannon as the F-16 approached from her starboard side, its pilot making no aggressive moves despite being in perfect position for a deflection shot. Through her canopy, Ghost could see the other pilot clearly, and the sight filled her with a mixture of hope and impossible recognition that challenged everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the bonds forged in the crucible of military service. The pendant at her throat pulsed with warmth that seemed to match the rhythm of her heartbeat, as if responding to proximity to its original owner. Ghost had worn Riley's dog tags for 12 years, carrying them as both memorial and talisman through countless missions and lonely nights. Now, 38,000 feet above the Pacific, the impossible seemed to be reaching out to her through the thin air and electromagnetic spectrum of aerial combat. Ghost made a decision that violated every principle of tactical engagement she had ever been taught. Instead of maintaining weapons lock on the F-16, she shifted her aircraft into formation position alongside the modified fighter. If she was wrong, the next few seconds would likely be her last. But if she was right, she was about to solve a mystery that had defined her career and shaped her understanding of loyalty, loss, and the prices paid by those who chose to serve in the skies above hostile waters. The two aircraft flew in close formation for several minutes, their wingtips separated by less than 20 feet of Pacific air. Through their respective canopies, the pilots studied each other with the intensity of warriors who had found something unexpected in the midst of battle. Ghost could see details of the other pilot's equipment that reinforced her growing suspicions. The helmet, the oxygen mask, even the arrangement of switches and displays in the F-16's cockpit belonged to an earlier era of military aviation. Slowly, deliberately, the F-16 pilot raised a gloved hand and pointed toward the western horizon. The gesture was unmistakably directional, an invitation or instruction to follow toward coordinates that held significance Ghost couldn't yet fathom. But the urgency behind the gesture was clear, as if time was running short for reasons that extended beyond the tactical situation. Control, Phantom Lead. Request permission to follow Bandit to new coordinates. I believe this situation is more complex than initially briefed. Ghost's transmission walked the fine line between military protocol and personal intuition. Ground controllers rarely approve deviations from established engagement parameters, but the circumstances had moved far beyond standard operating procedures. Phantom Lead, Control. Negative on course deviation. You are directed to complete engagement and return to base. The response was immediate and unambiguous, carrying the weight of command authority that brooked no argument. But Ghost detected something else in the controller's tone, knowledge of classified information that she wasn't cleared to access. The F-16 waggled its wings in the universal aviation signal for attention, then began a gentle turn toward the west. Its pilot was clearly expecting Ghost to follow, despite the radio instructions to the contrary. The tactical situation had evolved into something unprecedented, a direct conflict between official orders and personal recognition of something that transcended normal rules of engagement. Ghost felt the weight of 12 years of unanswered questions pressing down on her like physical force. Riley Cross had vanished while flying these same waters, under circumstances that had never been satisfactorily explained. The official investigation had concluded with the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug, pilot error, mechanical failure, or perhaps spatial disorientation, leading to controlled flight into terrain. But Ghost had never accepted those explanations, because she knew Riley's capabilities too well. Now, faced with an F-16 pilot whose mannerisms and equipment suggested impossible connections to that long-ago loss, Ghost found herself confronting a choice that would define the rest of her career. Follow orders and complete the engagement, or trust her instincts and pursue answers that might finally explain what had happened to one of the finest pilots she had ever known. The decision came with the clarity that only accompanied moments of absolute commitment. Ghost rolled her F-22 into a banking turn that brought her onto the F-16's heading, maintaining formation position as both aircraft began flying toward coordinates that existed beyond the boundaries of their original mission parameters. Whatever waited at the end of this flight path, it held answers that she had been seeking for more than a decade. Control, Phantom Lead. I am pursuing Bandit on heading 270. Will advise when situation develops. Her transmission was professionally neutral, but carried the weight of personal decision that superseded operational authority. In the hierarchical world of military aviation, such decisions were rarely forgiven if they led to negative outcomes. Phantom Lead Control. You are ordered to break pursuit and return to base immediately. Acknowledge. The controller's voice carried escalating urgency, as if Ghost's deviation from orders had triggered responses at levels of command authority she couldn't imagine. But the F-16 continued its steady flight toward the western horizon, and Ghost maintained formation despite the growing weight of consequences. The Pacific stretched endlessly ahead of them, its surface broken by swells and currents that spoke of weather systems and oceanic forces operating on scales that dwarfed human concerns. At 30,000 feet, both aircraft left contrails that would dissipate within minutes, leaving no permanent mark on the atmosphere they traversed. But Ghost felt as if she were flying toward something that would leave permanent marks on her understanding of reality itself. Her fuel gauges showed adequate reserves for extended flight, but Ghost knew that every mile flown toward unknown coordinates was a mile that would have to be retraced if her instincts proved wrong. The F-22's fuel consumption at cruising throttle settings provided approximately 2 hours of flight time, which translated to roughly 800 miles of range in still air. But Pacific winds and the energy requirements of formation flying reduced those numbers significantly. The F-16 beside her maintained perfect position discipline, its pilot demonstrating the kind of formation skills that took years to develop. Ghost found herself studying the other aircraft's configuration, noting modifications that extended far beyond simple engine upgrades. The wing roots showed signs of structural reinforcement, while the intake design suggested airflow characteristics optimized for high-altitude performance. Someone had invested enormous resources in transforming a conventional F-16 into something approaching next-generation capabilities. After 40 minutes of westward flight, the F-16 pilot made another gesture, this time pointing toward the ocean surface far below. Ghost followed the indicated direction and saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Rising from the Pacific depths was an island that appeared on none of her navigation charts, its landmass substantial enough to support what looked like runway markings and structural installations. Control, Phantom Lead. I have visual on an uncharted landmass, coordinates. Ghost began to transmit her position report, but her radio erupted with electronic interference that rendered communication impossible. The static wasn't random noise. It was the kind of systematic jamming that required sophisticated equipment and precise frequency knowledge. The F-16 pilot gestured downward more urgently, then began a descent toward the mysterious island. Ghost found herself faced with another decision point: follow the unknown pilot to a destination that didn't officially exist, or attempt to return to friendly airspace with fuel reserves that were becoming increasingly marginal. But the sight of the island had triggered something in her memory, a half-formed recollection of classified briefings and compartmentalized information. She had heard rumors during her years as a test pilot, whispered stories of facilities that existed beyond the reach of conventional oversight. Projects that operated in the gray areas between official military structure and private contracting, funded by budgets that never appeared in public documentation. If such places existed, they would require the kind of security that included electronic jamming and personnel whose official existence had been carefully obscured. Ghost made her final commitment to the unknown, pushing her throttles forward and beginning her own descent toward the island. As both aircraft spiraled downward through layers of Pacific atmosphere, she could see details that reinforced her growing comprehension of what she was approaching. The runway was definitely military specification, capable of handling high-performance aircraft. The buildings showed signs of long-term occupation, with communication arrays and support facilities that spoke of permanent installation. But most significant were the aircraft visible on the ground, several more modified F-16s, their configurations matching the one she had been following. This wasn't a random encounter with a single rogue pilot. It was a systematic operation involving multiple aircraft and extensive support infrastructure. The implications stretched far beyond what could be explained by conventional military structure. As they approached the island's airspace, Ghost felt the electromagnetic jamming begin to fade, replaced by radio transmissions on frequencies she didn't recognize. The voices were professional, using standard aviation terminology, but with call signs and procedures that belonged to no organization she could identify. It was as if she had stumbled into a parallel version of military aviation, complete but separate from the official structure she had served for her entire career. The F-16 pilot made one final gesture before beginning final approach, a hand signal that Ghost recognized from her early training days, when Riley Cross had taught her the subtle communications that allowed pilots to coordinate without radio transmission. It was a personal signature, as distinctive as a fingerprint, and seeing it performed exactly as she remembered sent chills through Ghost's entire body. Landing gear extended as both aircraft aligned with the island runway, their approach speeds controlled with the precision that marked professional pilots regardless of the mystery surrounding their current situation. Ghost felt her F-22's wheels touch down on concrete that felt solid and real beneath her aircraft, the island's existence confirmed by the physical reality of successful landing. But as her fighter rolled to a stop and she began the process of engine shutdown, Ghost realized that solving the mystery of Riley Cross might be only the beginning of understanding what she had discovered. The island, the modified aircraft, the electronic jamming, and the pilots who supposedly didn't exist pointed toward something far more complex than a simple case of missing personnel. Through her canopy, she could see figures approaching across the tarmac, their flight suits and equipment suggesting military backgrounds, but lacking any official insignia or unit markings. They moved with the purposeful discipline of people accustomed to operating in an environment where standard procedures had been replaced by improvised protocols born of unique circumstances. The F-16 pilot who had led her to this place was climbing out of the cockpit with movements that seemed both foreign and familiar. As the helmet came off, Ghost felt her world shift on its axis. The face that emerged belonged to someone she had known, grieved for, and carried in her memory for 12 years. Lieutenant Riley Songbird Cross looked exactly as she had the day she disappeared, unmarked by time or circumstance in ways that challenged every assumption Ghost had held about life, death, and the nature of reality itself. But there were differences too, subtle changes in posture and expression that spoke of experiences that extended far beyond what Riley had known during her official military service. The eyes held knowledge of things that couldn't be found in any training manual, while her movements carried the kind of caution that developed after operating for extended periods in environments where standard support structures didn't exist. Ghost completed her own shutdown procedures with the mechanical precision of long practice, but her mind raced with questions that seemed to multiply faster than they could be answered. If Riley was alive, why had she never attempted contact? What was this island, and why didn't it appear on any chart? Who was funding the modifications to the F-16s, and what was the purpose of maintaining pilots who had been officially declared dead? As she climbed down from her aircraft, Ghost felt the Pacific air against her face, warm and humid with the distinctive smell of salt and aviation fuel. The island felt real beneath her boots, solid and permanent in ways that contradicted its absence from navigation charts. But reality, she was beginning to understand, was far more complex than official documentation suggested. Riley Cross walked across the tarmac with steps that seemed to measure the distance between past and present, between official truth and hidden reality. When she stopped just out of arm's reach, Ghost could see details that confirmed her impossible recognition. The scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the precise arrangement of freckles across the bridge of her nose, the way her mouth quirked slightly upward when she was thinking through complex problems. "Hello, Ghost," Riley said, her voice carrying the same inflection that Ghost remembered from countless briefings and debriefings. "I've been wondering when you'd finally find us." The words hung in the Pacific air like a challenge to everything Ghost thought she understood about military service, personal loyalty, and the prices paid by those who chose to serve in the gray areas between official policy and operational necessity. But more than that, they carried an invitation to understanding that had been 12 years in the making. Ghost felt the silver pendant against her throat, its weight suddenly insignificant compared to the presence of its original owner. But the questions that had driven her to this moment remained unanswered, and she realized that finding Riley Cross was only the beginning of discovering what had really happened to the pilots who had vanished over the Pacific during the past 2 decades. The island stretched around them with evidence of long-term habitation and systematic operation, its facilities maintained with the kind of attention to detail that required significant resources and careful planning. But perhaps most significant was the sense that she had finally arrived at a destination she had been seeking without knowing it existed, guided by instincts and loyalties that had operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. Riley gestured toward a building that showed signs of being a briefing facility, its architecture suggesting military construction but lacking any official markings or unit designations. "There's a lot you need to understand before you decide whether to stay or go back," she said. "But first, I owe you an explanation for why I never came home." Ghost followed her across the tarmac, each step carrying her further from the world she had known and deeper into understanding of realities that existed beyond the boundaries of official military structure. The F-22 Raptor sat behind her like a connection to the life she had known, but its presence seemed increasingly irrelevant compared to the questions that were finally beginning to find answers. As they reached the building, Ghost realized that she was about to learn things that would fundamentally change her understanding of military service, personal loyalty, and the costs of protecting national security in an increasingly complex world. But more than that, she was about to discover what had really happened to the pilots who had vanished over the Pacific, and why their disappearance had been carefully maintained as classified information for more than a decade. The door opened to reveal an interior that looked like a cross between a military briefing room and a civilian corporate conference facility. Maps covered the walls, showing Pacific shipping lanes and weather patterns alongside notations that used terminology Ghost didn't recognize. But the overall impression was one of systematic intelligence gathering and operational planning that extended far beyond what could be accomplished by any single military unit. Other figures moved through the facility with the quiet efficiency of people, accustomed to working in small teams under circumstances that required improvised solutions to complex problems. Their equipment was military-grade, but lacked standard issue markings, while their bearings suggested professional backgrounds that had been adapted to circumstances that existed outside normal organizational structures. Riley gestured for Ghost to take a seat at a table that showed signs of extensive use for planning sessions and intelligence briefings. Around the room, displays showed real-time information about Pacific air and sea traffic, weather systems, and electromagnetic emissions that painted a comprehensive picture of activity across thousands of square miles of ocean. "The short version is that we didn't disappear," Riley began, her voice carrying the weight of explanation that had been years in the making. We were recruited for something that required us to stop existing in any official capacity. The crashes, the missing aircraft reports, the unsuccessful search and rescue operations, all of that was carefully orchestrated to provide cover for pilots who were needed for missions that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Ghost felt the pieces of a complex puzzle beginning to align in her mind, but the picture they formed challenged everything she thought she understood about military structure and operational oversight. Recruited by whom? She asked, her voice carrying the professional skepticism that had kept her alive through a dozen combat deployments. Riley's expression grew serious, the kind of gravity that accompanied discussions of classified information and compartmentalized operations. By people who understood that traditional military structure wasn't adequate for addressing certain types of threats. Foreign powers were developing capabilities that required responses outside normal engagement parameters. We became the response that officially didn't exist. The briefing room around them hummed with activity as other personnel moved through their duties with quiet efficiency. Ghost could see displays showing real-time tracking of aircraft and shipping across the Pacific theater, information that suggested surveillance capabilities far beyond what should have been available to an unofficial operation. But the technology appeared genuine, its data feeds comprehensive and current. The island is designated Station Echo, Riley continued, her voice settling into the rhythm of formal briefing delivery. It's been operational for 15 years, funded through budget allocations that exist in the margins between acknowledged programs. Our mission is to monitor and intercept threats that require responses which can't be traced to official American military assets. Ghost studied the maps and displays around the room, noting patterns of activity that suggested systematic intelligence gathering across enormous areas of Pacific airspace and sea lanes. The scope of the operation implied resources and authorization at levels that required involvement from the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. But the absence of official acknowledgement suggested something even more significant: plausible deniability for actions that might be necessary but politically sensitive. How many pilots? Ghost asked, beginning to understand the scale of what she had discovered. The modified F-16s on the tarmac represented significant investment in aircraft and training, while the island facilities spoke of long-term commitment to operational capability. 43 currently active, Riley replied, all officially listed as missing in action or killed in training accidents. Our aircraft are rebuilt from salvaged airframes, modified with technology that doesn't appear in any official inventory. We operate under call signs and procedures that exist parallel to, but separate from, standard military protocol. The implications hit Ghost like physical force. 43 of America's most experienced pilots had been removed from official service and assigned to operations that existed beyond the reach of normal oversight. Their families had grieved their deaths, their units had held memorial services, and their names had been added to walls and monuments dedicated to those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. But instead of dying, they had been assigned to a different kind of service that required the complete erasure of their previous identities. The families, Ghost said, her voice barely above a whisper, they think you're dead, they've been grieving for years. Riley's expression carried the weight of personal cost that came with operational security requirements. That was the hardest part, she admitted. But contact with anyone from our previous lives would have compromised the entire operation. The threats we monitor and intercept require responses that can't be connected to official American policy. Our existence has to remain classified at levels that preclude any personal contact. Ghost thought about her own years of carrying Riley's dog tags, the memorial services she had attended, the quiet conversations with other pilots about friends who had been lost to the unforgiving demands of military aviation. The grief had been real, but the loss that prompted it had been carefully constructed fiction, designed to provide operational cover for assignments that required ultimate sacrifice of a different kind. What kinds of threats? Ghost asked, her tactical mind beginning to process the strategic implications of what she was learning. The Pacific Theater encompassed enormous areas of international waters and airspace, with shipping lanes and flight corridors that carried significant portions of global commerce. Threats in such an environment could have implications that extended far beyond regional security concerns. Riley gestured toward a display showing real-time tracking of multiple contacts moving across the Pacific Basin. Foreign submarines conducting intelligence gathering in international waters, but using patterns that suggest preparation for more aggressive operations. Aircraft testing, American response times, and radar coverage. Shipping that appears commercial but carries electronic signatures suggesting dual-use cargo. The tactical picture painted by the displays showed a complex web of activity that existed below the threshold of official concern, but collectively suggested preparation for operations that could threaten American interests across the Pacific region. Individual incidents might be dismissed as routine intelligence gathering, but the patterns revealed systematic probing of capabilities and response procedures. Our mission is to monitor these activities and, when necessary, respond in ways that can't be traced to official American military assets, Riley continued. Sometimes that means electronic jamming of foreign intelligence gathering. Sometimes it means close-approach reconnaissance that pushes the boundaries of international law. And sometimes it means direct intervention that has to remain unacknowledged. Ghost began to understand the operational requirements that had led to the creation of Station Echo and its complement of officially dead pilots. Traditional military responses to ambiguous threats required authorization processes and documentation that could compromise operational security or create diplomatic complications. But pilots who didn't officially exist could operate in the gray areas between peace and war, responding to threats that required immediate action but couldn't be officially acknowledged. The engagement today, Ghost said, pieces of understanding clicking into place. You were testing our response procedures, weren't you? Seeing how quickly we could scramble and what tactics we would use against unidentified aircraft. Riley nodded, her expression carrying professional respect for Ghost's tactical analysis. Foreign powers have been conducting similar tests for months, probing our radar coverage and response times. We needed to understand our own capabilities from their perspective. Your formation responded exactly as our intelligence suggested it would, but there were tactical refinements that could improve effectiveness against more sophisticated opponents. The revelation cast the entire engagement in a different light. What Ghost had experienced as life-or-death aerial combat had actually been an elaborate training exercise designed to evaluate American air defense capabilities. But the skill level required to conduct such an exercise safely spoke to the exceptional qualifications of the pilots who had been recruited for Station Echo operations. The rudder flutter that caught my attention, Ghost said, remembering the moment when the tactical situation had first seemed familiar. That was intentional communication, wasn't it? You were trying to tell me something specific. Riley's expression softened with something approaching nostalgia. It was the same signal I used during training flights when I needed to communicate emergency procedures without radio transmission. I hoped you would remember it from our time together at flight school. When you changed formation position instead of continuing the attack, I knew you had recognized something significant. Ghost felt the weight of 12 years of questions beginning to resolve into understanding, but the answers brought their own complications. The pilots of Station Echo had sacrificed their official identities and personal relationships to serve in a capacity that required complete separation from their previous lives. But their families and friends had paid a different price, living with grief and loss that was carefully maintained fiction, designed to protect operational security. Why bring me here? Ghost asked. Why risk exposing the operation by revealing it to someone who's still part of the official military structure? Riley's answer came with the weight of careful consideration and strategic planning. Because Station Echo needs pilots who can operate in both worlds, maintaining official status while conducting unofficial missions. The threats we're monitoring are becoming more sophisticated, requiring responses that need coordination with regular military assets. We need someone who can serve as a bridge between our operations and official command structure. The proposal carried implications that Ghost was only beginning to understand. Serving as a liaison between Station Echo and official military structure would require maintaining security clearances and operational cover that extended far beyond normal compartmentalization requirements. It would mean operating in multiple worlds simultaneously, each with its own rules and requirements. "The pendant you've been carrying," Riley said, her voice carrying personal weight alongside operational considerations. "It was modified before I left. The silver contains a transponder that responds to specific electromagnetic frequencies. When you flew close enough during the engagement, it activated systems that confirmed your identity and authorized my approach. We've been monitoring your career and waiting for the right moment to make contact." Ghost felt the silver pendant against her throat, its familiar weight suddenly carrying new significance. For 12 years, she had worn it as a memorial to a lost friend, but it had actually been a sophisticated identification device designed to enable contact when circumstances required revelation of Station Echo's existence. The technology required for such a system spoke to resources and capabilities that existed at the highest levels of military research and development. "How long do I have to decide?" Ghost asked, understanding that the choice before her would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her career and personal life. Accepting assignment to Station Echo would require sacrifice of everything she had built during her official military service, while declining might mean returning to normal duties with knowledge that couldn't be shared or acted upon. "The operation is reaching a critical phase," Riley replied. "Intelligence indicates that foreign powers are preparing to test American responses to increasingly aggressive probing operations. We need additional pilots and aircraft to respond effectively, but they have to be personnel who can maintain operational security while coordinating with official military assets." Ghost looked around the briefing room, taking in the displays and equipment that represented years of careful development and operational refinement. The pilots and support personnel moved through their duties with the quiet competence that marked professional military operations, but their lack of official existence created operational constraints that required constant improvisation and adaptation. "What happens to my current assignment?" Ghost asked, thinking about the F-22 squadron that was probably conducting search and rescue operations based on her failure to return from the engagement. Military aviation was a tight community, and unexplained losses generated investigations that continued until satisfactory explanations were found or classified information required termination of inquiry. "Your aircraft will be found drifting in international waters with evidence of mechanical failure and successful ejection," Riley explained. "The search and rescue operation will continue for the prescribed period. Then you'll be listed as missing and presumed lost at sea. Your personal effects will be returned to your designated beneficiaries, and your service record will reflect the ultimate sacrifice made in service to your country." The clinical description of her own official death sent chills through Ghost's entire body. Riley and the other pilots of Station Echo had experienced the same transition, watching their official identities end, while their actual service continued in forms that couldn't be acknowledged or commemorated. But the sacrifice enabled capabilities that couldn't be achieved through conventional military structure. Ghost felt the weight of decision pressing down on her like physical force. Everything she had built during 12 years of military service, rank, reputation, relationships, would have to be abandoned for assignment to operations that existed beyond the reach of normal recognition or advancement. But the alternative was returning to official duties with knowledge of threats and capabilities that she couldn't act upon through conventional channels. "I need to see the full scope of the operation," Ghost said, her decision crystallizing with the clarity that accompanied moments of absolute commitment. "If I'm going to sacrifice my official career for this, I need to understand exactly what I'm accepting responsibility for." Riley's expression carried approval and something approaching relief. "Follow me," she said, leading Ghost toward a section of the facility that required additional security clearances and identification procedures. "You're about to see capabilities that exist nowhere else in the American military structure." They passed through security checkpoints that utilized biometric scanners and electromagnetic verification systems, each layer of protection confirming that access to certain areas of Station Echo required clearances that existed parallel to official military classification systems. The technology appeared current and sophisticated, suggesting funding sources and technical support that operated outside normal procurement channels. The secured section of the facility contained aircraft maintenance bays that housed the modified F-16s Ghost had observed during the engagement. But up close, the extent of the modifications became apparent. These weren't simply upgraded engines and avionics. They were complete reconstructions that incorporated technology from multiple generations of fighter aircraft development. "The airframes are built from F-16s that were officially destroyed in training accidents or combat losses," Riley explained as they walked among the aircraft. "But every major system has been replaced or upgraded with technology that represents the cutting edge of military aviation research. The result is aircraft that possess capabilities that approach or exceed those of officially recognized fifth-generation fighters." Ghost studied the nearest F-16, noting structural modifications that suggested radical changes to aerodynamic characteristics and performance parameters. The wing roots showed evidence of complete redesign, while the engine bay appeared configured for power plants that produced thrust levels far beyond original specifications. Someone had invested enormous resources in creating aircraft that possessed capabilities that officially didn't exist. "Who authorizes this level of expenditure?" Ghost asked, understanding that the technology represented investment that required approval at the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. The modifications to each aircraft probably cost more than the original purchase price of a new fighter, while the island facilities represented infrastructure investment that required long-term strategic planning. "Authorization exists at levels that require compartmentalization beyond normal classification systems," Riley replied. "The threats we monitor and respond to operate in areas where traditional military structure isn't adequate. Our funding and authority come from sources that have to remain separated from normal oversight processes." They continued through the maintenance bays, observing technicians who worked on systems that appeared to combine conventional military hardware with experimental technology that belonged in research facilities rather than operational aircraft. But the integration appeared complete and functional, suggesting years of development and testing that had occurred parallel to official military aviation programs. "How do you maintain operational security with this many people?" Ghost asked, noting the substantial support staff required to maintain the aircraft and island facilities. Each person represented a potential security risk, but Station Echo's existence required personnel numbers that approached those of a conventional military installation. "Everyone here has been recruited from military backgrounds and thoroughly vetted for psychological stability and loyalty to American interests," Riley explained. "But more than that, they understand that their service here provides capabilities that can't be achieved through conventional military structure. The mission creates its own loyalty and operational security." Ghost observed the interactions between personnel as they moved through their duties, nodding the kind of professional camaraderie that developed in small units operating under demanding circumstances. But there was something else, a sense of purpose that came from understanding the strategic importance of their mission and the unique nature of their contribution to national security. They reached the communications center, where displays showed real-time intelligence gathering from across the Pacific theater. The scope of surveillance capabilities represented by the equipment suggested technological resources that rivaled those of major intelligence agencies. But the focus remained tactical and operational, oriented toward immediate threats rather than strategic intelligence gathering. The communications equipment allows us to monitor foreign military and intelligence traffic across multiple frequency bands and encryption protocols, Riley explained. We can intercept and decode communications that provide advance warning of operations that might threaten American interests or allies. But more importantly, we can respond to those threats in ways that can't be traced to official American military assets. Ghost studied the displays showing current intelligence, noting patterns of activity that suggested systematic probing of American capabilities across multiple domains. Foreign submarines were testing response times and tracking capabilities, while aircraft conducted electronic intelligence gathering missions that pushed the boundaries of international law. The cumulative effect was a picture of preparation for operations that could threaten American interests if left unopposed. The mission isn't just monitoring, Ghost realized. Understanding the full scope of Station Echo's operational requirements. You're conducting active responses to these threats, using aircraft and personnel that officially don't exist to deny foreign powers the intelligence they're seeking. Riley nodded, her expression carrying the weight of operational responsibilities that extended far beyond conventional military assignments. Sometimes that means electronic jamming of foreign intelligence gathering operations. Sometimes it requires close-approach reconnaissance that provides counterintelligence about foreign capabilities. And sometimes it requires direct intervention that has to remain completely unacknowledged. The implications painted a picture of military operations that existed in the gray areas between official policy and operational necessity. Station Echo's pilots were conducting missions that were strategically essential but politically sensitive, using capabilities that had to remain classified at levels that precluded normal oversight or accountability. Ghost felt the full weight of the decision before her settling into focus with crystalline clarity. Accepting assignment to Station Echo would mean sacrificing everything she had built during her official military career, but it would provide opportunities to serve at levels of strategic importance that couldn't be achieved through conventional military structure. The choice represented the ultimate expression of military service, complete dedication to mission accomplishment regardless of personal cost. "What's the timeline for my decision?" Ghost asked, understanding that operational requirements probably didn't allow for extended consideration of personal implications. Military service at this level required immediate commitment and total dedication, with personal concerns subordinated to mission requirements. "The situation is developing rapidly," Riley replied. "Intelligence indicates that foreign powers are preparing to escalate their testing of American responses within the next few weeks. We need additional pilots and aircraft operational before that timeline expires. If you're going to join us, the transition has to begin immediately." Ghost looked around the communications center, taking in the displays and equipment that represented capabilities she had never imagined existing outside official military structure. The personnel moved through their duties with the quiet competence that marked professional operations, but their dedication to mission accomplishment was evident in every interaction and procedure. "I accept," Ghost said, her voice carrying the weight of commitment that would reshape the remainder of her life. "But I need to understand the complete operational picture before I can contribute effectively. What aren't you telling me about the threats we're facing?" Riley's expression grew serious, the kind of gravity that accompanied discussion of classified information at the highest levels of sensitivity. "The foreign operations we've been monitoring aren't random intelligence gathering," she said. "They're systematic preparation for a coordinated operation that could threaten multiple American interests simultaneously. The timeline for that operation is accelerating, and our current capabilities aren't adequate to respond effectively." The revelation cast everything Ghost had learned into a different context. Station Echo wasn't just monitoring foreign activities and conducting occasional interventions. It was preparing to respond to a coordinated threat that required capabilities beyond those of conventional military structure. The stakes extended far beyond regional security concerns to encompass threats that could affect American interests globally. "What kind of coordinated operation?" Ghost asked, her tactical mind beginning to process the strategic implications of systematic foreign preparation for operations that required such extensive preliminary intelligence gathering. "Simultaneous operations across multiple domains," Riley replied. "Submarine operations designed to interdict shipping lanes while aircraft conduct electronic warfare against American communications and radar systems. The goal appears to be creating conditions that would allow follow-on operations to proceed without effective American response." Ghost felt pieces of a complex strategic puzzle beginning to align in her mind, painting a picture of foreign planning that required responses outside the capabilities of conventional military structure. The kind of coordinated operation Riley described would require careful timing and extensive preparation, but it could achieve strategic objectives that would be difficult to counter through traditional military responses. "How long before this operation is expected to begin?" Ghost asked, understanding that the timeline would determine how quickly Station Echo needed to develop enhanced capabilities and operational responses. "Intelligence estimates suggest 6 to 8 weeks, Riley replied. "But the preparation activities we're monitoring indicate that timeline could accelerate based on political or strategic developments that we can't predict or control." The timeline meant that Ghost's transition from official military service to Station Echo operations would have to be completed quickly and efficiently. There would be no opportunity for gradual adjustment or extensive training on new procedures and equipment. She would have to master modified aircraft systems and classified operational procedures while contributing to mission planning that could determine the outcome of strategic operations affecting American interests across the Pacific region. "What happens to my F-22?" Ghost asked, thinking about the advanced fighter she had flown to this encounter. The aircraft represented millions of dollars of investment and years of training to master its systems and capabilities. "It will be configured for Station Echo operations," Riley explained. "The stealth characteristics and advanced sensors make it ideal for reconnaissance and electronic warfare missions that require capabilities beyond those of modified F-16s. But the modifications will remove it from official military inventory, making it another asset that officially doesn't exist." Ghost felt the final connection between her old life and her new assignment being severed with clinical efficiency. The F-22 had been the culmination of her official military career, representing mastery of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the American inventory. But modified for Station Echo operations, it would become a tool for missions that couldn't be officially acknowledged or commemorated. "When do we begin?" Ghost asked, her commitment complete and her focus shifting to operational requirements and mission preparation. The personal costs of assignment to Station Echo were significant, but the strategic importance of the mission superseded individual concerns. Riley's answer came with the weight of operational urgency and strategic necessity. "Immediately," she said. "Your official death needs to be established while search and rescue operations are still active, and we need to begin modifying your aircraft and training you on classified systems before the foreign operation reaches the point of no return." Ghost felt the weight of transformation beginning, as she crossed the threshold from official military service to operations that existed beyond the reach of normal oversight and accountability. But more than that, she felt the satisfaction that came from accepting assignment to missions that would utilize her skills and experience at the highest levels of strategic importance. The briefing room around them continued to hum with activity as personnel monitored threats and prepared responses that would protect American interests without official acknowledgement or political complications. Ghost realized that she was joining a community of warriors who had accepted the ultimate sacrifice, not death in combat, but complete separation from the lives and identities they had built in service to their country. As Riley led her toward the next phase of orientation and mission preparation, Ghost felt the silver pendant against her throat one final time before removing it and handing it back to its original owner. The gesture marked the end of 12 years of carrying memorial to a friend she thought she had lost, but more than that, it marked the beginning of service at levels that would require sacrifice of everything she had been in order to become what her country needed her to be. The Pacific air around them carried the salt smell of endless ocean and the aviation fuel scent of aircraft prepared for missions that would never appear in official records or historical accounts. But Ghost understood that the most important missions were often those that remained hidden, conducted by warriors who accepted anonymity as the price of protecting the nation they had sworn to serve. Her transformation from Lieutenant Colonel Kestrel Ghost Thorn to whatever identity Station Echo would provide was beginning, but her dedication to the mission remained constant. The threats facing American interests required responses that couldn't be achieved through conventional military structure, and she was prepared to provide those responses regardless of personal cost. The future stretched ahead with uncertainty and challenges that would test every aspect of her training and experience, but Ghost faced it with the confidence that came from finally understanding her true purpose. She had found her way home to a mission that required everything she could give, and she was ready to give it completely.